It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Good morning.
And we also have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello. We've got the most brainy talk show host in America underway today, listeners. You'll wait and see.
And Thom Hartmann.
And Thom Hartman.
Thank you, guys. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you all.
Yes. Well, I'm going to set the topics on the table. We're going to talk to Thom Hartmann, fellow broadcaster, who most of you know is the host of the Thom Hartmann program, which is heard on all sorts of radio, TV, and digital outlets. This man has a resume as long as my arm, and I have a very long arm. We could spend the whole show just listing his credits as a broadcaster, an author, and an entrepreneur. But buried in his biography, I also found that he has been rostered as a psychotherapist in Vermont for 5 years. And he also holds a trainer's certification in NLP, which stands for Neuro-Linguistic Programming, which explores the connection between our brains, the language we use, and our behavior patterns. And as a country, we're all experiencing a bit of psychological trauma under the administration of Donald Trump. And today, we're going to talk to Thom about how to handle that. How do you handle the bully behind the bully pulpit? And we'll probably discuss how the Democratic presidential candidates should handle Trump on the debate stage. Do you try to ignore, humiliate, punch him in the nose? We'll also update you on the latest machinations going on in the corporate underworld with our corporate crime reporter, Russell McIver. Wouldn't be a show without Russell. But first, let's get right to it. Let's talk to Thom Hartmann about how to handle Donald Trump.
This is going to be great. Thom Hartmann is live daily from noon to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on commercial radio stations all across America, on nonprofit stations via the Pacifica Network, and on channel 127 of the Sirius XM satellite radio network. Talkers Magazine ranks Mr. Hartmann as the #1 progressive talk show host in America. He is also a 4-time Project Censored award-winning New York Times best-selling author of 24 books in print. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Thom Hartmann.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Tom, in prior interviews, we've talked about your groundbreaking scholarship where you documented that infamous Supreme Court decision, which actually wasn't a decision declaring a railroad a person for purposes of the 14th Amendment. It was in dicta, or it was the scribe that wrote up the opinion that stuck it in.
Yeah, John Chandler Bancroft Davis.
Yeah, you pretty much revolutionized corporate history with that finding, and certainly got people into, well, how did these corporations get all the constitutional rights that we have? I mean, they're artificial entities, they're not human beings. And now you're starting a series, which we're going to talk about later in the show, on the secret history behind this and that. And I'll leave that as a blank just to entice our listeners. And right now, I do want to have your take, and I'm sure our listeners want to have your take on Donald Trump, his reality show strategy daily, and how do you handle him?
Well, to go back to what they taught me in psychotherapy school, Ralph, when confronted with a bully, kick him in the nuts. I really think that this is what the Democrats need to be doing. They need to be going at Donald Trump with everything they have, and just calling him a racist is nowhere near enough. He's also a criminal. He's also a thief and has been throughout his life. He's a rapist, and that's fairly well documented. I mean, these are words that really need to be attached to him, particularly if he's going to do things like telling the 4 women, the squad, the so-called squad, to go back to the countries they came from. And it was plural. He was talking to all 4 of them. And him and Lindsey Graham are going to call him communists and all this kind of crap. I mean, it's really time to bring the war into his face.
Well, let's parse that for a moment. He gets away with giving terrible nicknames to his political opponents, and the press, including New York Times, Washington Post, dutifully report the nicknames. They don't ask for a rebuttal by the tarred person, and pretty much it sticks in people's minds, millions of people's minds. They think of, Crooked Hillary, Lying Ted Cruz, Little Marco Rubio, and it just goes on and on. He's got one for Biden. He calls Bernie Sanders Crazy Bernie. And I've provided a lot of nicknames. I think he should be called Dangerous Donald or Decadent Donald or Corrupt Donald or Cheating Donald. And here's an example, I think, of what you mean. when he went after those 4 women in the House of Representatives, saying you go back to the country where you came from, I tweeted something that went like this. Trump wants these 4 women to go back to the country where they came from. On that logic, Trump, a corporate criminal and a government outlaw, should go back to his ancestral Germany. I hear that Chancellor Merkel is looking for a chauffeur. Is that what you mean?
I love it. Yes, exactly. And very well said, Ralph. And I don't think, frankly, he would qualify to be her chauffeur, tragically. But
by the way, he also said, quote, I don't have a racist bone in my body, end quote. He said that many times, Donald Trump. So I just tweeted, Donald Trump constantly says, quote, I don't have a racist bone in my body, end quote. He's right. It's all in his brain.
Yeah, or maybe his fat is racist. I don't know. But
so what happens is, and you made this point brilliantly the other day when I was talking to you. You said he's the world's expert on reality shows, and he gets up every morning or in the middle of the night, and he says, how am I going to dominate the news?
Yeah, and this is something that is so overlooked and ignored. NBC spent millions of dollars training Donald Trump to be a good reality show host. It's probably the only thing that he's actually good at. He's failed at the vast majority of his businesses, even the businesses that he has made money on. The money that he's made is tiny compared to other people in his industries. He basically has one thing that he's good at, and that's doing a reality show. And in a reality show, they teach you a couple of things. Number one, and this isn't unique to reality shows, this is true of all fiction. The hero of the show is not as important as the bad guy. Superman would be boring without Lex Luthor. Batman would be boring without the Riddler and all that kind of stuff. Silence of the Lambs, Clarice, an FBI agent, it would have been a boring show without Hannibal Lecter. The bad guy is actually the most important character in fiction, as well as in reality shows. They cast somebody to be the evil person in every show. And sometimes it's even the host, but there's this hierarchy of casting. And he gets that. And he realizes that he's only as good as the people he's fighting against can be characterized as being bad. So rule number one, create the bad guys, cast the bad guys, or name the people that you're going against as bad guys in a way that everybody agrees is bad. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean evil. I mean, in the case of Jeb Bush, it was low energy Jeb. But that is death for a Republican or for somebody who wants to become president of the United States. So he's been trained to do that, number one. Number two, always set up the next show, always tease the next show, and do it in a way that keeps people going, what? Really? I got to see this. And so everything he does always has and guess what's coming after that attached to it. Number three, you want to do absolutely everything you can to be the center of attention, essentially. And now this comes naturally to him, I think, in many ways. It's how he's lived his life long before NBC taught him how to fine-tune his skills. And he's bringing all of these reality show skills, and there's a few others that are more secondary, tertiary. He's bringing all these reality show skills that the consultants and the coaches at NBC so well taught him to the White House, and he's running a reality show out of the White House. And every single day, it's like, okay, take a look at the landscape of the media narratives and the media landscape. And if there's something out there that has grabbed the media landscape, for example, most recently, Jeffrey Epstein's story. And now then it came out that Bill Barr said, I'm going to recuse myself from this because my law firm used to represent Epstein. And then it came out that Epstein's got pictures. Epstein's got, security tapes. He's, you can see who went into his house and who left his house and what they were doing. And Alan Dershowitz comes out and goes, I kept my underwear on when I got the massage. And suddenly Bill Barr is like, I'm going to unrecuse myself and I'm going to insert myself into this investigation. But Donald Trump is looking at that going, uh-oh. And, what's it going to take? How high do I have to jump with this particular basketball to drop it into the hoop, to grab the news cycle from something as outrageous as Jeffrey Epstein? Well, let's tell 4 women of color to go back to the country they came from. And he's succeeded. For 2 days now, 3 days, he's owned the news cycle, and Jeffrey Epstein has been pushed off the front page. And that's just one small example, but he literally has been doing it every day since, frankly, he's been doing it every day since he got the Republican nomination.
Yeah, the whole idea is to put everybody on the defensive so they can't affect the news cycle themselves with their issues and agenda.
You do that by defining them as the bad guy.
And he mocks the mass media. He says, you can't do anything but replay what I'm saying because you get more ratings, you get bigger audiences, and you can sell more advertising and make more profit. So,
which, by the way, is true.
You have no choice. I mean, now, let's say you're advising the presidential candidates on the Democratic ticket. There's 24 of them. Most of them have decided to ignore Trump. They're focused on health care, living wage, immigration issues, and so on. Some people think that's a mistake, Thom Hartmann. And some people are advising people like Bernie Sanders to go head on against Trump, if only to distinguish himself from others who are carrying his agenda, like Elizabeth Warren, but also in order to goad Trump into making mistakes, going over the cliff sometimes, and getting into real trouble. What would you advise?
I think if you go back and look at a number of successful campaigns, both on the Republican and Democratic side, particularly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and I'm sure you could identify some of the, like Lyndon Johnson for Jack Kennedy, for example, what you're describing, Ralph, is the traditional role of the vice presidential candidate. And this is why I hope that whoever the presidential candidate is on the Democratic side picks as a vice presidential candidate somebody who really has an instinct for sticking the knife in, somebody who is willing to be outrageous, somebody who's not afraid of controversy, somebody who's willing to go on the attack constantly, because that's what we're going to have happen. And that allows the presidential candidate to essentially say, oh, yeah, Donald Trump, he's doing whatever he's doing, but that's Donald Trump. But I really want to talk about how important it is that 30,000 Americans died last year for lack of health care. And we spent twice as much. We spent 18% of our GDP on healthcare when the rest of the countries of the world spend 9%. I've got more important things to do than Donald Trump. And then the vice presidential candidate goes out and is just, slashing and burning. That's the way that it has, at least in theory, and actually in practice in many cases, been done in the past. And that would be my advice right now. But that's subject to change based on who the candidates are.
But in the meantime, before the primaries, you got all these candidates ignoring Trump, and Trump's dominating the news cycle.
I don't think that they should be ignoring him. I think particularly when you've got a large field like this, and if you look at the Republican primary, I think 2016, this is a perfect example. One of the advantages of a large field is that it provides you with an opportunity for every single person, whenever they speak, whatever they have to say, to attack Trump. Just like in the Republican primaries, every time anybody spoke, they attacked Hillary Clinton, knowing that she was going to be, in all probability, there by that point. Yeah, I guess both primaries are gone. In any case, assuming that she was going to be the nominee. So I think that the Democrats, if they don't wrap a Trump attack into most of their answers, and frankly, I would generalize this. I would take it beyond Trump. I would take it to the entire Republican Party, because Trump is the logical outcome of Nixon's Southern strategy. The Trumpification of the Republican Party, everybody's acting like it's something that just fell out of the sky. It didn't. This is an entirely logical progression. It needn't be Donald Trump himself, but somebody equally outrageous. So they need to wrap these two things together. They need to tie the entire Republican Party to Trump, particularly as they get more and more uncomfortable with him.
Yeah. I just wrote a column on where the Republican challengers to Trump. Listeners, get it on nader.org. And what I pointed out was, you have these people who think Trump is a danger to the Republic. They think Trump is going to sink the Republican Party for a long time. The chaos, the takeover, the imagery is all bad for the Republicans. The huge deficits that he's generating, very bad for the Republicans. So you have people like recently retired Senator Corker, he was head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Flake from Arizona. You have people like Christine Todd Whitman, who was the governor in New Jersey and the EPA administrator under Reagan, who can't stand Trump and actually asked for his impeachment. She's a Republican. You have people like John Kasich, who was the head of the House Budget Committee and then became governor for 8 years of Ohio. He can't stand Donald Trump. And you have others as well. In fact, just recently, Mark Sanford, the former governor of South Carolina and member of the House, until recently, he's testing the waters, but he hasn't declared. Bill Weld, who is former Republican governor of Massachusetts, has actually declared against Trump, but he hasn't gotten much news. What do you think is going to happen? Why I think they're intimidated by Trump. I think they are afraid of being verbally lashed and stigmatized with nicknames, going after their families the way Trump did against Cruz and Cruz's wife. I think that the lack of challenge against a Republican incumbent, Donald Trump, who cannot break 44% in the polls, has a low poll rating, a high disapproval rating, and he's not being challenged in the Republican primaries. What's your take on that?
If you remember your days in elementary school, the bully did two things. Number one was, willing to be a bully. But number two, brought people to his side. There would be people who would align themselves with the bully for fear of the bully, generally speaking. But then they became bullies themselves. And there's some shared self-interest there. What has happened among the Republican billionaire and donor class is that at first they were all looking down their nose at Donald Trump. Now they are largely all firmly on his side because he has quite literally given them what they want. He has given them, a couple of $1 trillion in tax cuts and deregulation and all these things. And so now I think it's not just that they're intimidated by Trump. They're afraid of being called names. They're afraid of the death threats that'll come from the alt-right and stuff like that. I think it's also that they're afraid that they'll lose their funding, that which is political death. I think that's what took out, as much as a potential primary challenger, that's what took out Flake and Corker as much as anything else, was that their funders were also intimidated or had aligned themselves with the bully. So, it's a more systemic problem than just Donald Trump. Number one, I don't see anybody successfully challenging him. I don't think there's going to be any Republican primary debates. I think anything that happens, Bill Weld is a crackpot, frankly. And so is Mark Sanford. I mean, or at least, formerly of the Appalachian Trail. Remember, this is the guy who had the mistress in Argentina and all that stuff. I mean, these guys have no chance. None. Zero.
Well, that conventionally would be a liability, but when you're up against Trump, I mean, he's trumped them on all those things. So
it may
wouldn't
be.
But I think
but
the
he
point
still has the support of the donor class. But the second point I wanted to make real quick, Ralph, if I can, because I'd love to get your take on it, is I'm beginning to think that he's going to refuse to debate the Democratic nominee.
He's going to what?
Refuse to debate the Democratic nominee.
That's why I had to ask you twice. Are you kidding? That'll make him a coward. He can't bear that.
No, I think he knows that his brain doesn't work as well as most of these guys. We'll have to see. I may be very wrong about this, but the sense that I'm getting is that he's feeling more and more besieged, more and more insular, more and more living in that Fox News bubble. And therefore, he doesn't need the rest of the media. He doesn't need the major networks. He doesn't need the publicity that would come from the debates. And he doesn't want to give any Democratic candidate, if he can successfully control the news cycle every single day, which he's done now for 2.5 years. There have been in some weeks, there has been one day where he hasn't been on the front page of the newspapers or the top story in the news. One day out of some weeks. If he can continue to do that, he doesn't need the debate. And in fact, the debates represent a liability, a potential threat to him, because he could be wounded by the debates. So I'm thinking that he's just going to flip the entire thing. I mean, keep in mind, from 64 until 1980, there were no presidential debates.
That's right. Well, you're right. Just backing up a bit, he has given the wealthy classes exactly what they want. I mean, the huge tax escapes and breaks, the lack of enforcement of the Internal Revenue Code, huge corporate welfare, crony capitalism, huge military contracts, no enforcement against Wall Street crimes. I mean, what's there not to like, right? With Trump, the only thing is that they don't like his personal behavior and his foul-mouthed verbiage. So he's very clever. In some ways, he's dumb as a rock, a phrase he used against his former Secretary of State, Tillerson. But in other ways, he's actually a street smart genius, isn't he?
Very much like Hitler and Mussolini were. And you recall not the first things that both of them did, but the things that they did as they consolidated power. And my concern is that Trump gets reelected, that's the end of the experiment of democracy in the United States, which is probably a whole other conversation. But one of the first things they did is they essentially delegitimized the opposition parties. This was before they outlawed them. And the first step in delegitimizing the Democratic Party is to refuse to use its proper name, as it was named by Thomas Jefferson. It was called the Democratic Republican Party until the 1820s, and then they dropped the Republican Party. It's been called the Democratic Party forever. And Joe McCarthy used to say, always call it the Democrat Party with an emphasis on rat. And Trump is doing that literally every day, to the point that, guests on MSNBC are starting to refer to it as the Democrat Party. So number one, to delegitimize the party, you don't even allow it to use its own name. And then number two, you don't allow it to have a presence. The Democrats come out with campaign policies. He doesn't respond to their policies. He pretends they don't exist. So if he refuses to debate them, he has massively delegitimized them. And then if he gets reelected, he can just, begin the process of essentially outlawing them.
We're talking with Thom Hartmann, daily syndicated radio talk show host extraordinaire. Thom, I want to ask you a question maybe nobody's asked you on the show. Let's face reality here. Donald Trump didn't win the popular vote. He came 3 million votes short of Hillary Clinton. So he was selected by the Electoral College. But he did win a lot of votes, tens of millions of votes. And so let me ask you, what has Donald Trump taught us about ourselves as a people?
It's a really good question, Ralph. And I think that what has happened is that what was always implicit has become explicit. Richard Nixon with his Southern strategy was sort of explicitly racist, but not so much. And then when Reagan came along, and as you know, the old Lee Atwater tape that David Corn found years ago, where he said, we used to be able to use the N-word, and then, we got a little more sophisticated and we started talking about busing. And then by the time Reagan came along, we didn't even need to talk about busing anymore. We could simply say tax cuts, and everybody understood that benefited white people more than black people, or in some cases, it even hurt black people. And so people got what we were saying. I think the Willie Horton ad might have been the exception, but that's how desperate George Herbert Walker Bush was, because he was such a weak candidate. But what was implicit, what was kind of quietly done, what was, the whole reason for the phrase dog whistle is only dogs can hear them, is that, making racist statements that only racists can hear, is that Donald Trump now is saying this stuff out loud. And this is a really dangerous thing. Number one, it reflects the racism that is inherent in our society, in our culture, largely among white Americans, but it occurs in other places as well, but largely white racism. But number two, it also is breeding a new generation of racists. I mean, basically when Nixon and Reagan, when Reagan gave his first speech after he was nominated the Republican nominee in 1980 in Philadelphia, Mississippi, just down the road from where Schwimmer, Goodman, and Cheney were murdered, the three civil rights workers they made the movie Mississippi Burning out of. And the entire speech before 30,000 white people was about states' rights. It was a dog whistle. The racists got it, the Southerners got it, but the media didn't even report it in that context. I mean, it was largely unreported and, unknown to this day. So the young people of America were not exposed to this racism in a way that could convert them, essentially, that would evangelize them. Trump has now turned it, by making it explicit, has begun this evangelical process, and now the whole alt-right has jumped into this. And they're recruiting like there's no tomorrow. They're doing it on YouTube. They're doing it on Twitter. They're doing it on Facebook. They're doing it on 4chan. They're doing it on 8chan. I mean, they're just doing it. They're doing it in the streets. They're putting billboards up and posters. White racism, white supremacy has gone mainstream now as a consequence of this. And that concerns me tremendously. I am very, very worried that the Turner Diaries scenario that Tim McVeigh thought he could bring into fruition, bring into reality, that Donald Trump is taking us closer to the possibility of something like that, an actual civil war in the United States.
Well, I think he's also taught us that we're doing a bad job as a people recruiting politicians. We don't do our homework. We don't know what their record is. There are too many millions of voters who are 5-minute voters. Is the person likable? Is he saying things you're saying that you don't want to say out loud? Does he air your own prejudices? Yeah, he's my guy, even though he is jeopardizing your jobs, freezing your minimum wage, jeopardizing your health care, exposing your kids to all kinds of toxic pollutants in the air and the water, and generally running your livelihood into the ground. It doesn't seem to matter as long as the dog whistles, as long as his general prescriptions promising a terrific healthcare system when we get rid of Obamacare. I'm going to give you clean air, pure water. I'm going to give you all kinds of industrial jobs. I alone can fix it. I mean, why are people so much smarter when it comes to their sports teams, but when it comes to their politicians, it's as if they're calling out, "Take me, I'm yours."
I think there's a real simple answer to that question, and it's one of the most important questions that nobody is discussing. If you watch sports television or listen to sports radio, you will hear a discussion not just of which team is more likely to win and which team is more likely to lose, but also why. This particular player knows this particular strategy. He knows how to get around this kind of a block. They go in depth into the sport. Our political discussion in our corporate media is completely different from that. It's all about who's up, who's down, what's the horse race. Bernie's been complaining about this for 5 years very, very loudly, and he's absolutely right, that the media will not talk about the issues. They will only talk about the issues if they're forced to in the context of how do these issues help or hurt these candidates. And even sports radio is more in depth, massively more in depth than the kind of political coverage that you're getting on MSNBC and CNN and the big three networks and on, generally on radio. And until that changes, and I think it's going to take something like either a return to the fairness doctrine or, breaking up big media to make that change. Until that changes, we're going to continue to have your 5-minute voters because they only have 5 minutes of information.
What's interesting is how much he's doing in his very base. I mean, when you really consider what he's taken away from them and what he's broken his promise and betrayed them, all the way down their entire spectrum of livelihood. I mean, the crumbling public services, for example. He promised he was going to have all kinds of infrastructure jobs. I'm a builder, he said. I know what that means. He hasn't done anything. Even his proposal came down to a measly $20 billion a year. And you know how many few bridges that'll pay for. And then he's denying climate disruption. So you got all of these red states being flooded like Louisiana. And here's a president who's basically saying it's a hoax. The hurricane intensity is a hoax. The tornado proliferation is a hoax. The rising sea levels are a hoax. And we're not going to do anything about it, Americans. And a lot of these people are living in red states that voted for him. So there's something deeply masochistic operating here, don't you think?
Perhaps. I'm inclined to think, going back to my last, riff, is that, again, this is a symptom of the media. The media is not pointing these things out. They're not talking about these issues. And so, therefore, Trump gets to dominate the discussion. And the corporate media, that you have interlocking boards of directors between the media. I mean, there's this amazing website, theyrule.net, THEYRULE.net. And you can plug in any of the big corporations, plug in Corporation A and Corporation B, and then push a button, and it'll show you how many steps you have to go through to find the interlocking board of directors. And in fact, in my book on equal protection, I went through 100 corporations and showed how all the top 100 corporations in America all have interlocking boards of directors. And you can literally say, okay, this person is on the AT&T board and also on the Wells Fargo board, and this person is on the Wells Fargo board and also on the NBC board, and this person's on the NBC board and also on the Monsanto board, and this person's, and it literally go around in this giant circle. So the media is unwilling to point these things out because they're all making money on this stuff, Ralph.
Tom, what's that website again?
It's called TheyRule, THEYRULE.net.
Well, on your program, you have 3 hours every day. Do you ever point out, I'm sure you do, that the people own the public airways? They're the landlords. The radio and TV stations are the tenants. They don't pay anything for their license. 24/7, they decide who gets on, who doesn't. They got the FCC in their pocket, and they got the members of Congress intimidated. They're really afraid of the local television stations, for example. Do you ever get a discussion among people about why don't they want to control more of what they actually own? The people own the airwaves.
Yeah, it's a good discussion, and we do have that from time to time on my show. The biggest challenge that we have, frankly, right now is the 1996 Telecommunications Act that Bill Clinton signed that, didn't entirely privatize the airwaves, but largely did. And now you've got the FCC coming out and saying that the deal that the United States made with cable companies back in the 80s was if you want to run your cable through our public rights of way, because cable is not over the air, if you want to run your cable through our public rights of way, you have to give back to the communities in the form of public access television stations, and you have to fund C-SPAN. Well, the FCC last week came out with a proposed rule ending that, which is going to, and cable access and this nonprofit access is like the last bastion of any kind of liberal programming that's on television anywhere in the country. And so, they're getting ready to pull that. I mean, they're taking that away. There's an all-out assault on the media. And then, of course, the Fairness Doctrine, which Reagan ended in 1987, said that if you want to maintain your license, since you're using our public airways, and this was, before cable was a big thing, if you want to maintain your license, you have to program in the public interest, was the magic phrase. It didn't say that if you carry Limbaugh, you have to carry Hartman. Far from it. It said basically you have to program in the public interest, and that was interpreted to mean news at the top of the hour. When I was a teenager, one of my first jobs, I was 16, was as a DJ. And I did that for 3 years, and then I did news for 7 years in Lansing, Michigan. And when I was doing news, if I got caught talking to the salespeople, I'd be fired. There was this wall between talent and sales. You could not, it just was not allowed if you were in the news department. And that got done away with in 1987. I mean, this was back in, from 1967 to 1978. But that got done away with in 1987 by Reagan. So between the loss of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987 and the Telecommunications Act in 1996, and now the corruption of the FCC, by both Bush and Trump, I'm very, very concerned about the future of broadcasting.
Well, I've written to the chairman of the Federal Communications Committee and asked him how he appraises his commission enforcing the 1934 Communications Act, which required that the radio and TV stations using our property had to pay attention to the public interest, convenience, and necessity, which means public news programming, local, and so on. Never even responded. Send it again. Never responded. Talked about it on the radio. Never responded. Send it to members of Congress. They wouldn't respond. That's how bad it is, people, because the only people they're afraid of, people, are the people like you listening to this program. And you've just got to organize yourself in a very dynamic way and enjoy life being assertive citizens, recovering the meaning of we the people in the preamble of the Constitution. Before we get to your new series, and this is going to really excite listeners, The Secret History of the Supreme Court of the United States, the Secret History of the Second Amendment, and so on.
Hidden history.
Do we have any comments from Steve and David? I'm sure you do.
Yeah, Tom, I've got a question. It goes back to the Trump and the whole racism discussion. What I hear coming from the right is, how can you call Trump a racist? Black unemployment is at an all-time low. How do you answer that? I don't know if that's factually true about black unemployment, but that's the claim. How do you answer that?
Yeah. Well, the recovery from the Republican Great Crash, the Republican Great Recession of 2007, 2008, the damage that Republican deregulation did to the economy, Obama did a pretty good job of putting us back on course. But that said, what's an awful lot of what's been going on is sugar high stuff, as I'm sure you know. If that has worked to the benefit of black people, that's great. It's worked to the benefit of everybody in that unemployment is relatively low, according to the official statistics. But black people, white people, everybody right across the board, by and large, unless you're making over a couple $100,000 a year, you're not seeing much of the benefit of that. Labor force participation rates, I think the last number I saw was 67%. Unemployment, if you are unable to find a job for more than a year, say you live in a part of the country where industry has just left. When NAFTA happened, they went to Mexico or they've gone to China or whatever. If you live in a part of the country like that where there just are no jobs, you can be unemployed. But if you're unemployed more than a year, you're not counted as unemployed. So you only show up in the labor force participation numbers. So instead of having 70, 80% of the people who are, eligible and willing to work working, we have, in the 60s right now, because we're just not counting people anymore. There's these different measures of unemployment. So number one, we have a false picture. It's a false narrative that, black unemployment is lower than it's ever been, or any unemployment is lower than it's ever been. And all you have to do is insert back in the labor force participation numbers, and which gets you to, I think it's called E6 as opposed to E1 or E2. Ralph probably knows these numbers better than I do.
Tom, even if they're employed, they can't live on what they're making. There's a frozen minimum wage that is completely separate from the unemployment rate and all its deficiencies, as you pointed out. Black wealth is 1/10 of white wealth. 1/10 of white wealth, in terms of their savings and the value of any housing they have. And so it's a very deceptive thing. He keeps saying it. Hispanic unemployment is at a record low. Black unemployment is a record low. Yeah, wages are pretty low too. You got millions of people who are making less than workers made in 1968, adjusted for inflation. Any comments, David, Steve?
I would like to ask you a question. I would assume I'm going to get crickets, but I've asked liberals and lefties, what do we do about white men? They have the highest rate of opiate addiction. They do feel disenfranchised, and they become tempted by the tiki torches. What do we do about white men? They do feel alienated.
Fewer number of white males in colleges than females. It's true. That's one reason Tucker Carlson's book was so popular, Tom, because he had a section of all kinds of statistics about white male debilitation. I mean, they're really, amount of drug addiction. They can't get adequate jobs. The jobs in industry they once had are gone. It's the plight of the white male, I think David is saying, isn't paid enough attention to.
And at some point, it becomes an identity.
I agree. There's maybe a couple of points that I'd make around this. A, I don't have an easy bumper sticker for you, and that's unfortunate. We need to be thinking about how to message that in a straightforward way. But basically, the white male has been raised with the privilege of being kind of at the top of the economic heap, and with the story, the narrative that he is responsible for being the breadwinner, and that's how his identity is defined, and that's how his social status is defined. When you talk to a man, typically the question is, what do you do? What do you do for a living? Not who are you, or, what do you like, or what are your hobbies, or whatever. And so white men define themselves this way. But Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson have done some absolutely brilliant research. They run a think tank out of the United Kingdom, and they published 3 books on this. So the first was called Why Inequality Matters. The second was called The Spirit Level, and they just came out with a third one, and I can't remember the title right off the top of my head. It has the word level in it also. And what they found is that as inequality goes up, now this is not poverty, this is inequality, just inequality. As the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, what happens in the middle is that levels of social dysfunction start to explode. And it's a linear relationship to a certain point, and then it almost goes log. And I'm talking about things like teenage pregnancy, sexually transmitted disease, suicide, mental illness, racism, and things like that as a subset of that. Homicide, suicide, I think I mentioned, drug abuse and drug addiction. These are symptoms not specifically of poverty, although the white male has been, relatively speaking, impoverished over the last 40 some odd years as a result of Reaganomics. I mean, wages have been absolutely flat after just exploding for the previous, 60 years. So white males have not been able to fulfill those roles that they thought in society, which is the most commonly pointed to answer to your question. But I think that if you look at the research that Wilkinson and Pickett have done, and they're really worth digging into, what you find is that sense of social alienation is another one. Trust, literally interpersonal trust. All of these negative indicators go up, or in the case of trust, it goes down massively, purely as a function of inequality. And by the way, there's a good body in the anthropological literature of this same thing among animals, among particularly mammals. And it gets very, very visible with primates, but even with, dogs and cats. If they detect a fundamental unfairness in their environment, they react to it by becoming neurotic, essentially, and angry, and in many cases, self-destructive. So I think that the rise of the billionaire class in the United States, along with the rise of deep poverty, although deep poverty has been with us for a long time, but principally the rise of the billionaire class is probably the main thing that's driving this. And it's the one thing that nobody ever talks about.
Great.
Well, listen, let's get to the series that you're starting to put out. Your first book, The Hidden History of the Second Amendment. And let me quote something that I don't think most people know, but that's why you're such a great historian. And this is the quote. As recently as the 1970s, the NRA, that's the National Rifle Association, and both political parties supported reasonable gun control measures and were willing to entertain even more comprehensive measures, end quote. You want to elaborate that?
Well, it's absolutely true. Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush were big advocates of gun control. And the NRA was, when it was a sportsman's association, was all in on gun control. In fact, helped write some of the legislation that had to do with what's called a duck load. If you're out duck hunting, you can't have more than 3 shells in your rifle because it's unsportsmanlike to have more than 3. To take more than 3 shots at a flock of geese or ducks. For example, there's other examples too, and the NRA helped write a lot of this legislation state to state about, what kind of equipment you could use when you go hunting, when you could go hunting, what were the rules for hunting to make it all sportsmanlike. All that went out the window in the mid-'70s when the NRA basically got taken over by the gun manufacturers and turned from being a sportsman's organization devoted to its membership to being essentially a lobbying and front organization for the weapons industry. And then along with that, they acquired massive political power because they got enormous wealth. And Ralph, you're the guy who taught us all this, back in the day in the 60s and 70s, that wealth driving political power then corrupts systems, whether it's systems that have to do with auto safety or whether it's systems that have to do with gun safety. And then that in turn corrupted the Republican Party and frankly the Democratic Party for quite a few years. So, that's the bad news. The good news, I think, is that the most powerful lobby in Washington, D.C. in 1997 and 1998 was the tobacco lobby. Nobody crossed the tobacco lobby. Mike Pence was out there writing op-eds about how tobacco doesn't cause cancer. When the lawsuits started happening in 97 and 98, and we started as a nation realizing that this industry had been not only lying to us for 60 years, but was aggressively killing us to the tune of, 500,000 Americans a year, the horror just shattered their power. And the tobacco lobby by 2001, 2002 had become just another lobby in Congress. I think the same process is happening right now with the NRA, which is one of the reasons why when I wrote The Hidden History of the Guns and the Second Amendment, I was thinking, this is, we made that decision 2.5 years ago when I started, but it seemed to me like this was the trend line. This was the direction. And now in the last year, we're seeing, all this infighting and the collapse and everything, which is very much what you saw with the tobacco industry in its end of its heyday. So, I think that there's good stuff coming down the road here.
The tobacco industry is considered totally invincible in Washington. Yep. We always point out it takes a lot fewer people than most people think once they're organized and focus on their members of Congress to turn these corporations around. Your next book coming out in October, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America. What's that about?
It's about how the Supreme Court, starting with the Marbury decision in 1803, basically placed themselves above both Congress and the president. And Thomas Jefferson went nuts about this, absolutely nuts. Said, if the Marbury decision stands, then the Constitution has become a thing of wax. The Marbury decision said, basically, the Supreme Court said that we have the power to strike down legislation that's been passed by Congress and signed by the president. And then in the later part of the 19th century and the early 20th century, they went beyond that and said, we have the power to literally write new laws. And the example that the right likes to use about that is Roe v. Wade, where in Roe v. Wade and then later in Planned Parenthood v. Casey actually was the one where it got real explicit. They came up with this 3-trimester thing. That's the job of the legislature. And I'm just mentioning Roe v. Wade because everybody is familiar with it, but there's dozens and dozens of examples of this. And interestingly, during the Reagan administration, Reagan had a guy in his Justice Department whose job was to figure out how to basically undo Brown versus Board of Education and Roe v. Wade, these two decisions that the Reaganites saw as, terrible decisions. And this guy came up with this extraordinary memo going back to the Marbury decision in 1803 and carrying it forward case by case by case and proposed what is sometimes referred to as court stripping, which is that Congress under Article 3, Section 2, the Constitution explicitly says that the Supreme Court shall operate under exceptions defined by Congress and under regulations defined by Congress. And so this guy came up with this whole memo and this whole political strategy that they would have Congress, when they seized control of Congress and the White House, that they would pass legislation saying essentially that we, Congress, are going to regulate you, the Supreme Court, under Article 3, Section 2, to say that the Brown versus Board of Education decision we're striking that down, and the legislation that we're passing to strike it down, you may not review. We're going to negate judicial review with regard to this, and the same thing with regard to Roe v. Wade. They never did it because they never got that control. But the guy who wrote that memo, his name is John Roberts, and right now he's the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court.
That's why you call it the hidden history. You know,
Yeah.
I came across years ago, Tom, the early Pennsylvania Constitution, before 1787, before the Constitutional Convention. And they refused to give their Supreme Court any authority to interpret their state constitution. They said it was none of the court's business. We, by referendum, are going to interpret our Constitution by popular referendum.
Debate. Yeah, and this was a huge debate at the Constitutional Convention, judicial review. Should the Supreme Court have the power of judicial review? And they largely all agreed no was the answer. And in fact, in Federalist, it's been about a year now since I wrote that book, so I'd have to go back and look, but I think it's in Federalist, well, I don't even want to throw a number out, but in the Federalist Papers, I think it's 71 or 72, as I recall. You know, Hamilton talks about how the court is the least harmful, the least likely to injure. They don't have the power of the purse like Congress. They don't have the power of the military like the executive. They are basically powerless. And, you know, he was trying to assuage the fears of people who thought that the Supreme Court might claim the power of judicial review, which is what happened in the Marbury decision. And Jefferson couldn't fight it because he won the Marbury decisions. So, you know, he was stuck. But it's a whole fascinating thing, and it sounds a little bit wonky, but I'm telling you, it's not. It's
not wonky at all, because McConnell, the majority leader in the Senate, Mitch McConnell from Kentucky, his mission in life is to install in the federal courts the most right-wing corporatists he can find. And it's already bearing fruit, because look at now the Supreme Court, which is I call the corporate Supreme Court, it favors corporations against workers, against voters, against, you know, you name it. It's a pro-corporate court. It isn't invalidating anything that might be called corporate excessive power. And look at the result. They ruled in Citizens United in 2010 that corporations could unlimited money for or against local, state, and federal candidates. Unlimited money, as long as they don't coordinate it with the candidates. I mean, Justice Stevens, who we just lost, bless his soul, John Paul Stevens, just passed away at age 99, called it about the most devastating anti-democratic decision ever made by the Supreme Court.
Yeah, his rebuttal in Citizens United, his dissent in Citizens United is must-read stuff. It only runs about 4 pages, and it's everybody in America should read it. I mean, it's shocking. He talks about Tokyo Rose, how, you know, under this decision, under Citizens United, Tokyo Rose would have been able to contribute to electoral campaigns and run campaigns in the United States. It's amazing.
Thom Hartmann, how many secret histories are you going to put out? And give us a sense of what the titles are.
Sure. Well, the first one was the hidden history of guns and the Second Amendment. The second one, which will be out this fall, which is available now, you know, to pre-order from your local bookstores or online, is the hidden history of the Supreme Court, the betrayal of America. The third one, which will be out next spring, which I finished writing about 3 months ago and is going through line editing right now. That third one is, we're still debating the title. I want the title to be The Hidden History of the Republican War on Voting. My publisher doesn't want the word Republican to be in the title, but, you know, so we'll see how that ends up. The fourth one, which I'm writing right now, is The Hidden History of the Rise of Monopoly and the Death of Free Enterprise in America. And we haven't yet come up with a title for it, but that's my working title.
And these are very clearly written. They're 192 pages. They're written to be read and understood. They're not huge volumes with esoteric social science jargon.
No, they're small books. They're small books, and my goal in this, and I pitched this as a 10-book series to my publisher, and they've been buying them 2 books at a time. And so we'll see. I've got contracts now for 4 of them. You know, if they do well, then we'll go to 6 and so on.
I've written a short book that I could have called The Hidden History of How the Rats Reformed the Congress, Tom. People are ordering it 5 at a time because it makes them laugh themselves seriously enough to organize Congress watchdog groups back home. And by the way, you can get that by going to nader.org or just go to ratsreformcongress.org, where you'll, by the way, get a free tutorial step by step on how you could collaborate with your fellow citizens and actually organize to summon your senators and representatives back home for these town meetings. Before we close, Steve, David, any last comments?
Yes,
or questions?
I have a lightning round. 30 seconds. Both men have to answer these questions. Thom Hartmann, how many books have you written?
Well, I've probably written around 40. I think I have 26 or 27 in print right now.
Ralph Nader, how many books have you written?
I've never counted. I think it's less than 20. What I'm amazed at, Tom, you have 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, and you got to do some preparation. Where do you get the time to write all these books?
That was my question. I wanted to ask how many hours each man spends each day writing. Thom Hartmann.
Here's my schedule. Louise and I get up at 5 in the morning. We put together my radio show. Over the next 3 hours and have breakfast. I go on the air at 9. I get off the air at noon. I come home from that and I write until 6. We watch the Rachel Maddow show from 6 to 7. Sounds like an ad, but it seems like she's the only person doing any kind of investigative reporting. And then we go to bed at 7. We spend another hour or so, looking over the news and trying to plan for the next day. And that's 5 days a week. And then on the weekends I write 5 hours a day, Saturday and Sunday when I can, which is most days. And I'm I'll just be the first to say I'm a hyperactive kid who grew up. I don't see this as a grueling schedule. I enjoy it. I love what I do. And so that's why.
David, I think you exaggerate the burden here. Let me reduce it. If Thom Hartmann just wrote one page in his book for 192 days and took the rest of the time off and didn't write a word, he would write a book a year. It's just incrementalism, David. Something that you cannot learn from Triumph, the insult dog that you keep associated with.
I learned it from Vietnam. I learned incrementalism from Vietnam.
Yeah.
How many hours a day? How many hours do you read each? I'd like to know each man. How many hours do you read each day? Yeah.
Oh, I read myself to sleep every night, so probably 2 hours a day. Well, and that's not for work. Part of it is for work, but then in the morning I spend at least an hour or two reading the news, so maybe 3 or 4 hours a day.
I spend about 5 hours a day reading.
There you are, David.
And at least an hour of what I'm reading is fiction, by the way. That's my relaxation.
By the way, I think I just asked some of the most important questions that people have to ask. How much time do you spend reading?
Yeah. And I'm guessing the average American would answer less than an hour, less than 10 minutes.
We have in our bookstore at the American Museum of Tort Law in Winston, Connecticut, tortmuseum.org, if you're interested. We have a big sign, and the sign reads, "Readers think and thinkers read." That tells the story. Anyway, we're out of time. We've been talking with Thom Hartmann, the syndicated brainy talk show host, 3 hours a day on well over 100 stations around the country, and the author of a whole series of books on the hidden history of this and that, showing that primary source research often comes up with the real truth, not the myths that we're taught about in school about our historical background. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Ralph. Thank you all.
That was humbling.
Yeah.
He's the real thing. It goes right back to the original documents. That's why he took apart, which no historian took apart, the Santa Clara case that turned corporations into persons. They never read the scribe stuff. He read it. Imagine, not a single major American historian came across that.
And he's not a lawyer.
No, he's just a smart guy.
We have been speaking with the legendary broadcaster Thom Hartmann. His latest book is The Hidden History of Guns and the Second Amendment. We will link to his extensive body of work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Now we're going to take a short break and check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell McIver.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, July 19, 2019. I'm Russell McIver. The Justice Department is pursuing a criminal investigation into whether Johnson & Johnson lied to the public about the possible cancer risks of its talcum powder. That's according to a report from Bloomberg. The criminal probe coincides with a regulatory investigation and civil claims by thousands of cancer patients that Johnson & Johnson's baby powder talc was responsible for their illnesses. Now, a grand jury in Washington is examining documents relating to what company officials knew about any carcinogens in their products. Questions about the product's safety have led to more than 14,000 lawsuits from consumers asserting that the company's talc products cause their ovarian cancer or mesothelioma. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell McIver.
Thank you, Russell. I want to thank our guest again, Thom Hartmann. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. A transcript of this show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org and have it delivered straight to your inbox. For more from Russell McIver, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
And Ralph's new book's out, The Fable, How the Rats Reformed the Congress. To acquire a copy of that, go to ratsreformcongress.org. And To the Ramparts, How Bush and Obama Paved the Way for the Trump Presidency and Why It Isn't Too Late to Reverse Course. We will link to that also.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, David, Steve, Jimmy, and to our listeners, spread the word about the program. The Ralph Nader Radio Hour is willing to be on more programs and more stations around the country.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the Wrap-Up, where Steve asked Thom Hartmann a question about the Second Amendment.
Tom, I have a question. If you've got an extra couple of minutes here, I want to take it back to the Second Amendment. I've read Akhil Reed-Amar on the Second Amendment, and I don't know how familiar you are with his argument. I imagine you are.
I am not at all, actually. I've not read his work.
Well, basically, he's arguing that both sides of the gun debate misinterpret the 18th century language of the Second Amendment, which is, and I'll quote, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And basically what he's saying, and I hope I can represent this accurately enough for an intelligent conversation, is he says the anti-gun people get it wrong because they misinterpret those words, especially the words people and militia, as sort of a state army, sort of a national guard. And that's where the guns, that's what it was meant to be. He says that's not right. What he's saying is basically that the words people and militia in those days were essentially synonymous. And this is where the pro-gun people get it wrong. It's not about everybody having a gun. It's not about hunters or target shooting or sportsmen or anything like that. It's mainly what Madison, who wrote those lines, meant was that the army should consist of citizens, of voters, that it shouldn't be a professional mercenary army that is separate from the citizenry. I guess the most modern model is Switzerland for that sort of this people's citizens army. And that's how he says both sides get it wrong. What's your take on his take?
Do you have 3 or 4 minutes?
Sure.
Okay. And I lay this out in the book with chapter, verse, and quotes. One of the main issues that was brought up at the Constitutional Convention was the fear of a standing army during time of peace. These guys were all scholars of European history, and they knew that country after country, going all the way back to the Greek democracies and the Roman Republic, were overthrown from within by their own armies once the wars were over. And so the question was, how do we get rid of the army? How do we force Congress to, on a regular basis, ask themselves the question, do we want a standing army during time of peace? And the conclusion that they came to is found in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, where it gives Congress the right to raise taxes and spend money for anything to any extent for as long as they want, as long as it serves the general welfare, with one single exception, and that's the Army. The Army may not be funded for more than 2 years, period, full stop. So every 2 years, Congress has to ask themselves the question, do we want an army? The Navy could be funded, but not the Army. So then the question, so they all agreed on that. And in fact, the constitutions of 5 different states had built into them language that said standing armies during times of peace are a menace to a free society. And Pennsylvania, Georgia, there was a bunch of them. There were at least 5, and I quote them in the book. So they were virtually unanimous on that. Then the question became, okay, if we don't have an army, how do we defend ourselves? Keep in mind, this was a time when the Spanish controlled Florida, the French controlled Louisiana, the British controlled Canada, and the whole western frontier was filled with pissed off Indians who were upset that their land had been stolen and their people had been murdered, raped, and robbed, and were the victims of genocide. And so the solution that they came up with for that was that the individual state militias, which were in existence and had been for over 100 years at that point in time, and in some cases longer, that those individual state militias would be able to be called up by Congress, and that's in Article 1, Section 8, and that there had to be something that essentially authorized those militias. They just wanted to add a codicil to that. And so the original language started out by basically quoting Pennsylvania's Constitution, saying that standing armies during times of peace are a menace to a free society, therefore, et cetera, language like sort of like we see in today's Second Amendment. But it said for the security of a free nation. So in 1789, in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, this language came up, and Patrick Henry, who was the largest slaveholder in the state of Virginia, got up, and ironically, the guy who said, "Give me liberty or give me death," got up and gave this long speech, and I quoted at some length in the book. And Madison, keep in mind, the guy who wrote the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth drafts of the Second Amendment, or was the largest participant in writing them, was sitting right there. I mean, he was also a Virginian, he was also a slaveholder, and he was part of the Virginia Ratifying Convention. And Patrick Henry gets up and points out that Article 1, Section 8 gives the president and gives Congress the power to call up the state militias. And he said, if we ever get an abolitionist in the White House, and if the abolitionists ever get control of the House and Senate, they will call up our militia in Virginia. But there's one point, actually, let me pause for just a second and fill in a little hole here that I forgot to set up. In the northern states, these were just militias. And they, in the southern states, though, they served three functions. Number one, they were the state militias in Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. They were the state militias. Number two, and perhaps most importantly, unlike the northern states where the militias were part-time like our National Guards are today, in the southern states, they ran continuously 24/7 because they were also the slave patrols. You can't have the institution of slavery without a police state. And this was enforced by the state militias that were literally called slave patrols. And number three, in most of the South, they were also the police, which is one of the reasons why today, if you're killed by a stranger in a southern state, odds are 1 in 3 you were killed by a cop. Our policing came out of the slave patrols. So anyhow, Patrick Henry gets up and he says, if one of these guys ever ends up in the White House and they take over the House and Senate, they will simply call up our militia in Virginia and have them go off to Massachusetts for some kind of Shays Rebellion, or have them go up to the Canadian border to protect us, and there will be a slaughter. He says there's 360,000 blacks in Virginia, and they will be coming for our families. They will be coming for us. And James Madison responds and says, "You're being paranoid, Patrick." And Henry's like, "No, I'm not." And he goes off in another rant about, "They will search that paper." And he was quite an orator. And then George Mason gets up and says, "I agree with Patrick Henry." So the compromise that was worked out, that Madison worked out, and I quote him in the book, saying, "You guys are paranoid." I mean, he didn't use the word paranoid. He said, "I was surprised by the ferocity of their argument." The compromise was to change the word country to the word state, so that the Second Amendment, in addition to empowering militias, would specifically allow states to have primacy when it came to the control of their militias, because in the southern states, they were also the slave patrols. So in its modern incarnation, the Second Amendment was written, and by modern, I mean post-1789, the Second Amendment was written to not only provide for the defense of the nation in the absence of a standing army during time of peace, but also to maintain the slave patrols in the South. Final footnote, there was broad agreement about this and understanding of everything that I just laid out from 1789 up until around 1815. And what changed the sentiment was Thomas Jefferson's presidency in the War of 1812. Jefferson, when he came into office, there were 360,000 men in the Army. When he left, there were 6,000 men in the Army. His mission in life was to completely abolish the Army, and he was nearly successful. But the state militias never got organized the way that everybody had envisioned at the ratifying convention. And so when the War of 1812 happened, 3.5 years after Jefferson left the White House, there was no militia, and the Army only had, a few thousand people in it. And the British just marched right down to Washington, D.C. and burned the White House. And so that was pretty much the end of the debate about whether we should have an army during times of peace. And that's why the Second Amendment, much like the Third Amendment, are complete anachronisms.
So if you were, and forgive me if I'm putting you on the spot here, if you were to rewrite those two lines, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms should not be infringed. If you were to rewrite that in 21st century language, the way the framers intended, how would you do that?
Oh, I think the framers said exactly what they intended. The point is that since the War of 1812, the Second Amendment has become completely unnecessary. We no longer rely on state militias. I mean, we developed an army after the War of 1812, and we never looked back. So the Second Amendment is just completely unnecessary, just like the Third Amendment, quartering soldiers in your home is completely unnecessary. They're relics of the Revolutionary era. And so I would do away with it altogether. And at the federal level, I would regulate weaponry with regard to technology. Basically, is it a fully automatic weapon? Is it a semi-automatic weapon? Is it a 50 caliber machine gun that can take that, an air, or even a single shot rifle that can take an airplane out of the sky? I'd have that top line regulation. And then the bottom line regulation, who can own a gun? What kind of process do they have to go through to own the gun? I'd leave that up to the states.
Well, very good. Thank you.
I told you he doesn't know what he's talking about.
I thought I'd stump him.
Right to the original sources.
Yeah. Really, what is it with all these primary sources?
Well, that's the thing with all these books. I have never been a fan of reading a history book and then trying to rewrite it. My dad wanted to be a history professor, and he had to drop out of college because Mom got pregnant with me. And I grew up with 20,000 books in the basement, and about a third of them were history books. And we talked history my entire life, my dad and I. And there's nothing I loved more when I was literally 12, 13 years old than going back and reading the letters between Jefferson and Adams, for example. Primary sources have been my obsession my whole life. I wrote a book on psychology, which I think is one of the most important books I ever wrote. It's called Walking Your Blues Away. And I went back to Franz Anton Mesmer in the 1700s, in the 1770s. And, where did this technology come from that Sigmund Freud was using? And why was Freud forced to stop using hypnosis? And, which now we refer to as EMDR and all this trauma stuff. It's amazing what you can find when you dig into primary sources.
Steve and I saw every episode of Welcome Back, Kotter when we were kids.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week when we talk American military policy with scholar Michael Clare. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too